So Rural Minds is a not-for-profit national organization. It just happens to be based at my farm in Mayville, but we are a national organization. And this is the reason that we're here today. This photo, and Kim, it looks like things are working again. This is a photo of my late nephew, Brooks, who at the time this photo was taken was 28 years old, and he's shown here with his 3-year-old twins. And if you can see in the background, you will see the Horseshoe Falls in Niagara behind him. My nephew was a very gregarious, very outgoing, very lovable guy, bigger than life, literally. He was 6'4", weighed 240. Even though he was born 4 months premature, he more than made up for it. And he worked part-time on our farm. I grew up on a farm in Sinclairville, and where I live now in Mayville is a working dairy farm. And so my nephew worked for both of our farms, as well as he had another job in Dunkirk where he worked. And so the story all starts 2 days before his oldest brother's wedding. So his oldest brother, my nephew Todd Jr., was the first in that family to get married. And it was a beautiful September day, typical September weather in Chautauqua County. Being a farm wedding, you can imagine the farm photos had cornfields in the back. As I tell people, I'm sure there was probably even a cow or a calf in the wedding party. And it was just one of those absolutely beautiful, picturesque Western New York days. And so the wedding took place, then the reception took place at the Gary Rodeo Grounds, which I'm sure most of you know where that is. And as we were leaving the reception that night, this guy, Brooks, my 28-year-old nephew, gave me a big hug and said, "Uncle Jeff, I just want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done for me and everything you've done for my family." Well, we didn't think anything of it because my nephew was a very grateful, very appreciative young man who always went out of his way to thank people for doing anything. So we said goodbye, and I was then heading back to my farm in Mayville. And my mother was turning 75 the next day, so we had a big party planned for her, especially since we had guests from out of town for my other nephew's wedding. So we're going about our farm chores and getting ready for mom's party and everything. And, the day after the wedding, it was just a typical farm day. The next day, however, is when the world changed forever, and when my family has been forever devastated and will never completely recover from what happened. So life on a dairy farm starts very early, as some of you may know. And at the point where this story all takes place, we had 3 farms, actually. We had. Can everybody hear me? I'm hearing some feedback from someone.
Oh, I can hear you.
Lisa, can you hear me? Hello?
I can hear you.
Yeah, not
Okay.
everyone was muted, so everyone please be sure to mute yourselves. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think that's what happens. Okay. So anyways, I'll continue. So the morning that the story started was, again, the reason Rural Minds was founded and the reason that we are here today. So after I was finished with the farm chores, I was heading back to my home, the main farmhouse on our farm in Mayville. And I went past my nephew's home. And as I approached his home, I saw emergency vehicles, I saw fire trucks, I saw an ambulance, I saw police cars. I knew something terrible had happened. So I jump out of the truck, I go running down the driveway, and the woman across the road, who I'd grown up with, his next door neighbor, with tears coming down her face, came running after me and grabbed me. And she said, "Jeff, don't go any further. We just found your nephew hanging from a tree in the backyard." Well, as you can imagine, the world stopped at that point. First of all, you never expect to hear your nephew is hanging from a tree. Second of all, in our case, it was completely unexpected with this person in particular. We had some other family members who had been struggling and other people who were in, various types of intervention. But my nephew Brooks, my 28-year-old, bigger than life nephew, had never appeared to have any issues, at least that we were aware of. He always seemed happy. He always seemed to be so well adjusted and so healthy that he was the last person in our family that would have ever been on our minds to die by suicide. But here he was. And so what happened is we went from a family wedding 2 days before to now planning a funeral for a 28-year-old. Again, on my mother's 75th birthday. This is the day that my mom's big birthday party was supposed to happen, which obviously never did. So as we're sitting in the study of the pastor at our small town United Methodist Church, the pastor point blank looked at my mom, looked at me, looked at my brother, and said, there are some people in the community who have said, we don't think we should talk about why your nephew or your grandson died. He said that there were even some people that have suggested we should come up with a different excuse, if you will, for why my nephew was gone. Some people had recommended he was in a farming accident. Some people had recommended he had had a heart attack. Again, a very healthy 28-year-old. And my mom, who had helped raise my nephew because of some issues that his parents had, with tears running down her face, said, Pastor, we're not only going to talk about it, we're going to start talking about it in detail, and we're going to start at his funeral. That was what planted the seed for what's now known as Rural Minds. I was offered the privilege of giving the eulogy at the funeral. And Brooks was more like a brother to me because my parents had helped raise him than he was a nephew. So as you can imagine, this was a very difficult proposition to even think about, giving a eulogy for a 28-year-old who had just died by suicide, leaving behind these beautiful 3-year-old twins. So I got through it somehow. And at the end of the service, we literally had people lined up for hours to not only offer their condolences, but to tell their story about what had happened in their families. My family has been in Chautauqua County for many generations, and we've been very active in agricultural circles. And, I come from a long line of dairy farmers. So many people know my family. And because of the courage and the candor of my mother in particular, all of a sudden, other people in our farming community and the county in Western New York in large finally felt that they had the permission to be open about their own struggles and things that had been going on in their own families, sometimes for generations. So Rural Minds was planted that day. It took us a few years to get the organization structured to ensure that we weren't duplicating efforts, because what happened is, as a result of my nephew's death, I started reaching out to other mental health not-for-profits to seek what kind of assistance we could get. And as I started making these calls, and I knew a number of these groups because I've spent the bulk of my career working in the healthcare industry. So I already had a relationship with many of these groups. And when I asked the question about what are you guys doing to reach people in rural America? Because the fact remains 46 million people in this country live in rural America. It's not a small part of our population. 46 million people. And the answer I got, regardless what group I reached out to, was we realize there's an issue, but we don't really know how to reach people in farming communities. We don't know how to reach indigenous people. We don't know how to reach people that live in mining communities in West Virginia or fishing communities in the state of Washington or Maine. And they encouraged us to found this not-for-profit organization with their help, because they said, you're doing exactly what we've wanted to do. You know rural America, you come from that world, let us help you. So 2 years ago, it was 2 years ago in November, Rural Minds was founded, and that's why I moved back to Chautauqua County. I was living just outside of Chicago at the time, and I decided that if I was going to be serious about this, and trust me, I'm very serious about the work we do, I needed to be back in a rural area. And so I moved back to my farm, and that's where, again, now I'm living, working, and running Rural Minds. So next slide, Kim. So the mission of Rural Minds is to serve as the informed voice of mental health in rural America and to provide mental health information and resources. We're solely focused on rural America because even though suicide and mental illness is an issue in suburban and urban America, the resources are there and the advocates are there. So we are focused completely on the work we're doing in rural America. And our vision is a rural America, including Chautauqua County, where there's no more silence, no more suffering or stigma. The stigma is really a huge part of what we're addressing right now, because mental illness and suicide in particular are highly stigmatized. But that's especially the case in rural America, because those of us who were raised in rural America, and I would imagine some of you come from similar backgrounds, are taught from a very early age to be independent, to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, to not depend on other people, and not to talk about our problems, especially problems as sensitive as mental illness. So generations of people in rural America, including me and my own family, never felt that we had the opportunity to talk about something like depression, schizophrenia, substance use disorder. So the stigma is a piece that is a big focus of our work. And that's one of the reasons that I always tell my family story at the beginning of any of these talks, is because we have to put a human face to this. We have to personalize this. And by me telling my family story and the journey we've been on, I'm hoping that other people will finally feel not only the opportunity, but in many cases, I think even the responsibility to start talking more freely about what's happening in their families. One thing I always like to leave groups with is mental illness is every much of an illness as is cardiovascular disease, cancer, even COVID. And so if we're diagnosed with breast cancer, prostate cancer, some type of a heart condition, chances are we will talk about that openly. We're not ashamed of that. We've got to start treating mental illness, suicide ideation, and substance use disorder in the same manner, because until such time that people understand and appreciate the fact that this is an illness, they're never going to seek therapy or medical intervention, which many times is required. If you're diagnosed with cancer, you're going to go to an oncologist and get on some type of a treatment pretty quickly. And we are hoping that by coming forward and telling the stories that we're now telling through Rural Minds, that we will give people the grace, if you will, to start talking about issues that have happened in their own family. The other thing is, this is very much a situation where mental illness runs in families in many cases. It certainly does in mine. There's a genetic predisposition to mental illness and substance use disorder, as some of you may know, just like there is, again, other forms of illness. So we also want families to talk more freely and openly about what's happened in past generations or the current generation, so that the future generations of that family can be more vigilant to things that might start to impact them on a daily basis. Next slide, Kim. So the emergency that we're really focused on now is the fact that people in urban areas are much more likely to suffer from mental illness and suicide than people in other parts of our society. Next slide. The suicide rates, as a matter of fact, people living in rural areas like Chautauqua County, shockingly, is 64 to 68% higher than those living in large urban areas. So we've got an emergency on our hands. Next slide. As I mentioned, 46 million people live in rural America, so it's a big part of the population. In 2020, which is when, of course, COVID hit, it was estimated that 12.7 million rural adults suffered from some type of an issue. And of course, COVID and the shutdown really exacerbated the situation, as you can imagine. This is another statistic that when we started this work was just so heartbreaking for me in particular, is that farmers, growers, producers, and ranchers are twice as likely to die by suicide as any other occupation. And you know what other occupation is right behind these professions? Veterinarians. Veterinarians have a growing and very high incident of suicide. And that's something that we are now addressing. I did my undergraduate work at Cornell University. I serve on the Dean's Advisory Council for the Veterinary College at Cornell. And so we are doing some things now with Cornell that we're hoping we can roll out to other veterinary colleges. Young people are disproportionately impacted by mental illness, and young people in rural areas in particular. The last statistic that I saw was that last year alone, 1 out of every 5 high school students seriously contemplated suicide. 20% of high school students seriously contemplated suicide. And the suicide rates, as you would imagine, are even higher in rural areas for all the reasons that they're higher in rural areas in the adult population. The good news here, what gives me hope, especially after the last 2 years of doing this work, is that young people are more apt to talk about topics that certainly my generation, the baby boomer generation, are not comfortable talking about. And so as I travel around the country and do talks like this, inevitably I'll have young people in the audience who are always the first to ask questions and always the first to make comments about their own journey and things that have happened in their family. So I have great hope that the next generation of our society is going to be the answer for not only this mental illness and suicide epidemic we find ourselves in, but for many other issues in our world. Kim, next slide, please.
Oh, no, I'm
so
fine.
these are just some. So these are just some other statistics that can be found on our website, and I would urge you all to go to our website after the call. Our website is ruralminds.org, and 3/4 of rural counties in America do not have a psychiatrist. 3/4 of rural counties. Even primary care physicians are much less prevalent. I know when I moved from Chicago back to Chautauqua County, I had to wait several months to finally get an appointment with a primary care physician to establish care. Fortunately, I didn't have any issues. If I did, I would have ended up at the ER, probably Westfield Memorial. But it's tough enough to find a primary care physician, but it's really hard to find a psychiatrist or even a psychiatric nurse practitioner. The other statistic here that is worth repeating is that we have an issue in this country, especially in rural areas, with broadband. And I mean, today is a good case in point of what we've been dealing with, right? I'm in a rural area here in New Jersey right now. So while telemedicine certainly helped many people during the COVID epidemic, it still isn't the panacea for people in rural America, because 30% of households in rural America don't either have any broadband or have inadequate broadband. Where I live, again, 5 minutes from Chautauqua Institution, I have broadband, but our farm manager who runs my farm for me, who has worked for us for 15 years, cannot get broadband because my house is the last house on our road where broadband is available. So even again in Chautauqua County, we have issues with broadband. So telemedicine is helping a lot of people, and it's certainly been better than not having any help, especially during COVID. But it still is not what it needs to be for people in rural America. The other thing I would say, and again, respectfully coming from a farm background and now living on a farm again, is that people many times in small town America are a little slower to warm up to people on the outside than perhaps people in big cities are. You have to earn their trust. You have to sit across the table at a local diner, look them in the eye and gain their trust and their respect. And so even in homes that have broadband, something as personal and as sensitive as mental illness isn't always an easy thing for people to talk about. And many people are still not comfortable talking to a provider on a screen that they've never met, who could be on the other side of the country. So we have a lot of work to do in this area with telemedicine and telehealth. But I'm comfortable if the Farm Bill ever gets through Washington, which it was hung up primarily, as you folks know, because of the issue with the Speaker of the House. And now we're in the middle of other chaos in DC. The Farm Bill is hung up, but the Farm Bill has provisions in there for expanding broadband access. It's one thing that Pete Buttigieg is very adamant about. It also has provisions in there for increasing mental health access and substance use assistance in rural areas. Next slide, Kim. So another thing that we run into in rural areas, including in Chautauqua County, including in my own family, is that there are many people who are either uninsured or underinsured. And so I had a person at one of the meetings I did over in the Finger Lakes region not terribly long ago who was uninsured, who's diabetic. And so he's paying for his insulin out of his own pocket. And, his point to me, he said, it's tough enough for me to pay for my insulin. He said, if I have to make a decision between paying for insulin and paying for an anti-anxiety medication, guess what I'm going to choose? So that is an issue. But one thing that I always like to include in this talk, and after having worked in the biopharmaceutical industry for my entire career, is that there are programs, as some of you may know, that pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, like Merck, like Johnson and Johnson, all the companies that work in the space have that provide access to medicines, even if you don't have insurance. They're called patient assistance programs. So if a person goes to a doctor and is prescribed something and they can't afford it because they don't have insurance, if you contact the manufacturer of that medicine, regardless what it is, I'm talking all medicines now, not just mental illness, chances are if you can hit a certain criteria, which many people who are underinsured or uninsured do, that medicine will be made free of charge to you. So that's something that if you're ever watching those direct-to-consumer commercials at night while you're having dinner, for whatever the disease category is, you may see at the end of the screen, if you need access to a particular medicine, call 1-800-Pfizer. I'm making that up, but many of those commercials have the number at the end. But if you go to any of those manufacturer websites, they will hook you up with the patient assistance program and will provide access for that medicine. One of the other challenges we have, and I've seen this firsthand now the last 2 years since I moved back to Chautauqua County, is the weakening agricultural economy, especially in the dairy farming industry. Quite honestly, our farm is so small that if I didn't have another job as a consultant, which is what I do when I'm not doing Rural Minds work, we would not be able to keep afloat. So it's a very difficult time in farming. Farming is dependent on what's happening with our climate. And you all are well aware of what we've gone through and continuing to go through with climate change. And probably more than almost any other profession in this country or in this world, farming is very dependent on what is happening with the weather. We do a lot of work with other commodity groups, the wheat growers, the soybean growers, the corn growers, and all of the big crop farmers are hurting right now because of the drought that happened in the Midwest. Now, because of some of these terrible winter conditions we're having, and even the freeze that's taking place will impact the crops come spring. So the agricultural economy, not only on the part of farmers, if you will, but also on the part of agricultural communities like Mayville, like Sherman, even Westfield, like Sinclairville, where I grew up. These small towns all around Chautauqua County have other businesses that are dependent on agriculture, whether it's the little diner, the barber shop, maybe the local gas station, what have you. So the agricultural economy and what's happening not only impacts those who are directly involved, like farmers, but also other rural communities. And this is, again, one of the reasons that we have now seen this escalating issue. And the last thing on this slide is, farming and life in rural America can be lonely. And I've seen that the last 2 years. Our winters are long. Right now, it's so darn cold and we've had all this snow and, you do feel this sense of isolation. And that certainly was the case during COVID. And so people in rural America don't always have the same outlets for social interaction and other things that people in suburban and urban areas do. And that can also increase the feelings of hopelessness and some of the other things that we deal with. Kim, next slide. So Rural Minds is really working across the gamut of not-for-profit organizations, including some of the large mental health groups that many of you have heard of, such as NAMI, some as MHA. We're also working with smaller rural nonprofits. Some of you may have heard of the National Grange. It's the oldest agricultural nonprofit in the country. It's been in existence 157 years now. It's located in 1,500 communities. Many of them are in Chautauqua County. And a little point of trivia, the very first Grange in the United States is and still exists in Fredonia, New York. It's right on Main Street in Fredonia, beautiful old limestone building, not far from the Commons there. And the Fredonia Grange was the very first Grange organization in the country. I'm actually a member of that. And so what we're trying to do is partner with organizations that are already considered the trusted place to go for people in rural America to get information, regardless what that information may be. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're not starting with new support groups or things of that nature. As a matter of fact, there's an MHA chapter in Jamestown that's phenomenal. We many times will recommend the people we advocate for in rural America to either join virtually or hop in your car and drive into Jamestown and join an MHA group. So because we are in this crisis situation, we don't have the time or the interest to try to put brand new support groups in place. Groups, again, like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and NAMI and MHA have been doing this work and fighting this fight for decades. And so what we want to do is partner with them to ensure that our people, the 46 million people in rural America, now have access to the same things that their suburban and their urban cousins have. Next slide, Kim. So the program that we just launched in November is called the Rural Mental Health Resilience Program. And again, if you go to ruralminds.org, you will find a lot of information on this program. And so this is a partnership we developed in conjunction with the Grange that I just talked about. Next slide, Kim. And it was launched at the National Grange meeting in November, which just happened to be in Niagara Falls, New York. Every year it moves around. The year before it was in Reno. Next year it's in Iowa. This year it was in Niagara Falls. And it was one of the most highly attended meetings that they've ever had. And so we had several hundred people there that this program was launched to. So if you go to our website, you will find many materials that are free, that can be downloaded for other local events, whether it's church events. If the league wants to put on something, you certainly are welcome to use these. We're finding PTA groups are using them. 4-H and FFA groups are starting to use them, the Farm Bureau, and many other groups. So in essence, it's a meeting in the box or a seminar in a box. So there's a PowerPoint slide presentation if someone wants to use that. There's a number of fact sheets. There are even items in there on how to promote this meeting. There's a templated press release. There's some tips on dealing with the local media. And again, thanks to Lisa and others with the league, you guys did a terrific job getting the word out about this call in particular today. But not everyone is savvy when it comes to how do you invite the local radio station or the local newspaper. So what we're attempting to do with this program is make what we've been doing for the last 2 years available and accessible to everyone, and to tap into that grassroots mentality of rural America and that resilience that exists, so that these organizations that already are in small town America can put on programs such as this conversation we're having right now. It also gives hints on tapping into local mental health providers. Many times when I do this in person in New York, I work with a group called New York FarmNet. It's a joint program that is funded by the state of New York and Cornell University. And it's a very unique program. I serve on the board of FarmNet, so I know a lot about it. But as I travel and do these conversations across the United States, I've become increasingly aware that this is something that New York and only New York has. And it is a tremendous resource because it's free, and it also provides free mental health counseling for those people involved in agriculture. And we have some of those counselors right in Chautauqua County. So if that's something that the league is ever interested in pursuing, I'm happy to make that connection. Next slide, Kim. So resilience, again, just to put this in perspective, is the dictionary defines it as the capacity to withstand or to recover quickly from difficulties, toughness. That's what rural life is all about. That's what farm life in particular is all about. So what we're hoping to do is to feed into that resilience by giving the communities these tools that they can then use with organizations or even in their own families. Next slide, Kim. And in the spirit of time, why don't we skip over this because I've already mentioned some of these resources. The next slide will show you just some of these resources that you'll find on our website. These are resources that have been developed, again, many times in conjunction with other organizations that are, again, all available free of charge. They can be printed and downloaded and distributed, put up on bulletin boards, used in newsletters, used in social media, however an organization would like to use them. So again, it's a new program that is only 2 months old at this point, but it's one that we are hearing already some really heartwarming anecdotal stories about. I heard one story recently from some people in California that put on a program. And after the program was over, a couple of days later, somebody who was in the audience that they didn't know contacted them and thanked them for doing this program and said, I was seriously contemplating suicide. And I saw the local newspaper run an article about your meeting. I came to the meeting, and because I came to the meeting, I have hope now, and I'm seeking assistance for my depression. So thank you. So, you know, again, that's one story, but we have heard other anecdotal stories, and we're very hopeful that this is a program that's pretty easy to use and to implement that will be helpful. Next slide, Kim. And again, some of these resources, let's just skip through this because I want to give plenty of time for Q&A. I've already mentioned some of these materials, so we can go to the next one. And so all of the materials you'll find are on the website. Again, you go to ruralminds.org and you will find all of them. And they're available as PDF documents, so they're easy to download and to use in various ways. We even have some churches now using some of these materials in their local church bulletins. I happen to be active with Hurlbut United Methodist Church at Chautauqua, and Hurlbut is one of the several local organizations that's gotten very involved with Rural Minds, and they have been very supportive and very encouraging about our work. Next slide, Kim. And while Kim's skipping over that, Kim, let's skip to the Rural Minds newsletter. In addition to what we have in the resilience program now, we do have a newsletter called Moving Forward that's free of charge. So you can go to our website, next slide, Kim, and look for the newsletter, and we would encourage you to sign up for that. I promise we won't send you a lot of spam if you sign up for that. We also do a series of webinars, as you'll see on the screen. The gentleman on the screen at the upper left-hand corner is a fellow native Chautauqua County resident. He now lives in Buffalo, but he grew up in Gary, New York. I actually went to high school with his father. which I didn't even know until we started this work together. Travis, who you see here, is a graduate of Casadega Valley and is a film producer. He produced a movie called Mother's Day. And if you get a chance, go online and Google Mother's Day. It's about his own mother's struggle with mental illness. And it was completely shot in Gary, New York. You'll see things that probably look familiar to some of you, like Heritage Village, like the Country Fair convenience store. And he filmed the entire movie, and it's won a number of awards. So he was just one of the many webinar guests that we've had in the last 2 years. And all of our webinars are archived and are on our website. So I'd encourage you to listen to some of the past.